Hello and welcome from TAZ 0. This is Cypherpunk Bitstream episode 0x03. I am Smuggler and I'm sitting here with
Frank Braun.
So Frank, what's the topic for today?
Today the topic is TAZs or Temporary Autonomous Zones.
Why are we talking about this?
Well, last time we talked about the second realm and this was more theoretical, and we said the implementation of second realm in the physical world would be a TAZ. So we're going to talk about this today.
Okay, so TAZs are one of the core technologies in the second realm strategy, and they're primarily physical. I mean, they're digital TAZs. The walled garden systems you could have, access controlled chat servers and stuff like that. But today we're about physical TAZs. And we're sitting in one because we've been working on building one for the last, 5 years. Maybe.
Yeah, at least. Maybe 6 or 7 even.
So it's one of our nice pastime projects that burned most of our Bitcoin that we ever made. And all the recordings that we do for Cypherpunk Bitstream happen from an actually existing TAZ with heating, I have to add. And it's located in Berlin, Germany, and it's built out of shipping containers. And we're going to get into why you use shipping containers, what a TAZ is specifically in this episode. So first of all, why do we build TAZs?
Well, we want spaces of liberty where only our rules apply.
And the problem for that is what?
Well, the problem is that others might not like that. So we have to deal with others not liking our places or us in our places.
True. Yeah, the problem really is that when you talk about government and rulership, it's usually it applies to territory and people, or people in territory. And a temporary autonomous zone attempts to create something like a pseudo-territory where the rules that apply both to the space and to the people in the space are different from the surrounding areas. So it's not legally an autonomous space, but it's factually an autonomous space, at least to a certain degree.
And that might lead to conflicts with the surroundings because they usually want to impose their rules on the entire territory. And if you want to do something else, they usually do not like that. And that might lead to conflicts. And conflicts usually follow certain escalations. Maybe you can say a little bit about that, how that usually works.
Yeah. I think it's always important to come back to fundamentals and try to understand how things actually work in the real world. And one of the fundamentals for interaction between people or systems is the OODA loop, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And it basically just describes the phases through which every participant of an interaction goes through. So the first thing you do is you observe what is happening. What does the other party do? Then you're trying to make sense of it. So that is the orientation phase. It basically means, okay, I have observed a certain behavior. Now I'm applying my knowledge about the world and about people and my own legal system or whatever to actually find out what that really is, what is happening there, and what it means for me. Then the next step is that you decide on what should be done about it, what you should do about it as a participant in an interaction. That's the decision phase. And lastly, you act on your decision. And in a conflict, you have at least two parties that go through this OODA loop towards each other. So, for example, our neighbors might be conflict parties, and they observe, for example, loud noises in the night. They try to make sense out of it and say, okay, those people are having a wild party, for example. They might then decide to call the police on us, so we shut up. And lastly, they actually call the police, and the police comes by, and the police would go through an OODA loop as well. They would observe themselves. They would say, okay, is this too loud? Is it not too loud? Do we want to do something about it? And then they would fine us, for example. So this is a relatively normal interaction in an OODA loop. And conflicts are usually a lot of those OODA loops iterating after each other. You know, you start with a very low conflict level, and then over time there's an escalation. And escalation usually means that the orientation, decision, and action phase becomes more extreme. And all conflicts sooner or later, sadly, end with either a party giving up or a party becoming overwhelmingly violent. So with states, we know that, you know, first states have diplomacy, you know, and then they cut diplomatic ties, and then they have sanctions, and finally they start killing each other. So that's an escalation.
And maybe we should add that the concept OODA loop actually comes from the military, from I think from air fights. Or
yes, yeah, air combat, yeah,
air combat, where you would have two pilots basically going through the OODA loop continuously in air combat, and but it turned out to be a really good model for other situations as well.
It's an extremely good model, especially because it also it gives you two interesting observations. Number one is that conflicts end with one of the parties not being able to complete the OODA loop anymore. So if you're able to undermine the observation, orientation, decision, or action phase of your opponent, then your opponent loses the conflict, or at least that specific round of the conflict. And the other thing that you can conclude from that is that one of the best things you can do is to undermine the OODA loop of the other party by being faster, by being less easy to interpret, having faster decisions, etc.
And at the same time, you have to make sure that your own OODA loop keeps running successfully.
Yes, you have to harden it.
So these are the two areas we can look at. How can you interrupt or attack the OODA loop of the other party, and how can you make sure your own OODA loop is still running?
Exactly.
And then we can basically look at all the four phases for all of these two cases.
Exactly. So that means in the context of the TAZ, we already know that we're in a conflict because we want to do something else than our surrounding environment. And our surrounding environment acts towards us, and we act towards the surrounding environment. And we both run through these OODA loops continuously. We might escalate, and sooner or later it gets a little bit too rough for one of the two parties. And that is the basics of temporary autonomous zones, is to understand that you're already in a conflict, and that this conflict progresses through multiple iterations of the OODA loop on both sides, and it escalates. And to keep an autonomous zone operational, you have to protect, harden your own OODA loop, while at the same time undermine the OODA loop of another one. So let's get started. What can you do to undermine the OODA loop of another party, of the attacking party?
Well, when you start with the observe part, you can hide. That means you should try to not be suspicious in the first place, or be hard to observe in the first place.
Right. So you wouldn't run a temporary autonomous zone in a highly visible public space. You wouldn't write on it that you're a temporary autonomous zone. You wouldn't point fingers at you. You wouldn't advertise it basically to everybody, so that that the fact that there's actually something different going on is hidden from a potential attacker.
Exactly.
And how can we, in this phase, harden our own observation capabilities?
Well, we mostly have to make sure that we see if something is happening. So we have to keep in touch with our environment, talk to neighbors, look if somebody is observing us, and basically employ some form of counterintelligence. See if somebody is coming by. Or
I think that the area of counterintelligence needs a little bit more explanation. So for us, for example, we keep in touch with our landlord, for example, to find out if there's anything changing for our property, or we want to find out if one of the state agencies has shown any interest. The other thing is that we observe our environment a little bit when it comes to, finding out if there are strange cars parking all the time, or if people show up in the neighborhood that we don't know and that looks suspicious. I think that's basically our observation phase, without going too deep into what technologies we employ for that. In the next phase, we have the orientation phase. As a reminder again, the orientation phase is the making sense phase. So you have an observation already, and then you need to make sense of it. The way in which we can attack an opponent's OODA loop there is, for example, that we have a cover story for our place. So you don't say this is a temporary autonomous zone, or a zone of anarchists, but instead it could be, I don't know, a hackerspace, or a private sauna, or a private club, So you don't necessarily come up with a story that attracts attention, or too much attention, or the wrong kind of attention, but you try to create an image in the mind of your attacker that satisfies him.
And I think there it's important to make sure that the cover story actually fits the environment. So that means it is believable that this location actually is in that environment. It has to fit yourself, and it has to kind of play into what people already know, ideally.
Yeah.
So, well, let's say you're this guy who's always running around in suits, and then you try to, sell the story of this is like an artist hacker space. That doesn't work. That's not very believable. Or, similar, if the location would be a very, formal location, then it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah. And the cover story should always be one that is uninteresting enough for an observer to not really feel invited to engage with it. So if you, I don't know, I'm really bad when it comes to coming up with bad cover stories, but you don't want to, for example, say that you're a brothel, for example, because that's already a shady thing to operate. It might be semi-illegal, it might attract extortionists, etc. So that's not a good cover story. That's actually making it worse than it already is. So you want a cover story that is disinteresting, that fits the environment, and that is perceived not as a threat. So it should be a friendly thing towards the outside, or at least a thing that is inconsequential.
Yeah.
So, and then another thing that one can use to undermine the attacker's orientation phase is actually to deliberately paint a positive image that the attacker is already used to. So, for example, you can hijack something that within your environment has a lot of support. So, for example, if you would start a soup kitchen in an environment where there are a lot of poor people, then this is a positive thing that you're doing. And you're basically hijacking what people wish they would see in the environment. So that is actually one of the reasons why a lot of 1%er motorcycle gangs are very specifically doing social work, is they're causing ambiguity and doubt when it comes to people saying that motorcycle gangs are a bad thing, because then there will always be other people that say, no, they're good people, they're running the soup kitchen, or they're helping the homeless, or they're at their children's hospital, and helping out. So in a way, this undermines the ability of the attacker to actually say, this is a threat, I have to work against it. So.
Yeah, I think that's also for recruiting what many organizations do, that they do something, charity, charitable activity, and use that to, first of all, get this positive image, but also to recruit people.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of funny that, when you look at the activities of states, they do similar things, so for example, there's this, official guideline, I think still, that the CIA is officially forbidden from interacting with USAID, which is this help organization of the US government, because they really want to make sure that nobody doubts that USAID is actually something really good and not just a cover story for the CIA. But I think there's a lot of doubt if that is actually true. In the context, for example, of finding Osama bin Laden, there is a story of fake doctors, or actually real doctors, running around and giving free vaccines to people. And in reality, it was about collecting DNA and to, maybe find his children, and through his children find him, So I'm not sure if that story is really correct, but it's basically the same model. You hijack a good cause to hide your actual plans in them, and make it hard for an opponent to understand what you're actually doing.
Yeah, one example in that area would also be the fact that a lot of intelligence agents are often employed in the embassies of their host of their country. So because that's the obvious thing, it's the obvious cover story. You're a foreigner and you're in the country because you work for the embassy.
Yeah.
Right. And it's much easier to do than a deep implant.
Yes. Plus you have a diplomatic immunity to get you out of the country instead of, going to jail.
That helps too. Yeah.
That's really good. However, you also have to defend your own orientation phase. And I think that is one of the areas where we are often failing. Because, so at least in my perception, I might be very wrong there, is that a lot of liberty lovers and anarchists don't really have a good understanding of the world in general. We for us, liberty is an emotional topic, and it's also something that is very different from how our opponents operate. It kind of feels dirty to try to find out how they work, or try to make sense out of them. There's often this, I want to ignore the state completely, I don't want to know how it works, or another thing that I really hate when I hear it is when people say, oh, the state is just stupid, the police is stupid, you can't ignore them, and I think that if you believe in that, if you believe that the state is stupid when they believe that the police is incapable of doing anything right, then you already failed in your orientation phase, in a way, you are already completely incapable of going through conflict with the state. Because you have this completely unfounded inner image that is coming to bite you whenever you're in a real conflict.
Yeah, I think you have to make sure that you kind of understand how the state works on a system level, and also how the people who are running the state or working for the state, how they are driven.
Yes, what their values are. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's another mistake a lot of libertarians make, is that they think they can just go to a different place, and they ignore the fact that they might not know that much from their own place, but they know a lot already. So if you go to a different place, different state, different culture, different people, then you have no idea how the system actually works.
Yeah, it's kind of like you know that from children, you know, when they put their hands above their eyes, and because they cannot see you, they think that you cannot see them either. You know, I think that's basically the same thing there. You know, it's this assumption that your own ignorance protects you in some way. And I think that knowledge is actually what you have to have. You know, you really have to understand your opponent, your environment. You have to keep up to date, so to speak, on what's happening. And that means, for example, that you really have to know how the law works. You know, I mean, you're breaking the law, quote unquote, you know, to some extent. You should know what laws you break and how they're enforced, what kind of punishment you should expect when you're caught, and all those things. You know, you have to have an understanding where your conflict actually is. And if you run into police, or if you run into a neighbor, or if you happen to have an interaction with the bureaucracy, you kind of should know what kind of interaction this really is. You know, if it's hostile or if it's friendly. You know, you really have to understand your situation to be able to do that.
Yeah, and you have to know if they're actually enforcing laws, if there's a jurisdictional process, or if bribery is the way to go in your country, or however the system works.
Yeah, yeah.
Because what's written in the books is often very different from how it's actually working.
True. Yeah. True. So that is a big point. The other big point, you mentioned that earlier, is that you have to understand the people that are working for the opponent. You know, and at least our experience is that not all of these people are inherently evil bastards. You know, often they're not. You know, they might have different values or just a different biography. You know, they might have very similar values, but just ended up in a different place. And it often makes sense to try to get to know those people on a personal level and on a professional level. You know, try to learn how they really think, try to learn what triggers them, you know, try to learn what their tactics are, what their methods are, etc. And this can be relatively theoretical. So a good way to learn about that is actually going to the library, your local public library, and, for example, getting the police handbooks. That's required reading if you're active in any sense, is to get the police handbooks, investigators manuals, stuff like that. You know, they're oscillating between deadly boring and highly interesting. So you have to just consider it as part of your job to go through them and actually learn how the other side operates. And the moment you learn, or you know how they operate, you can actually judge much better what it means when they do certain things. You know, what does it mean if they employ certain tactics or technologies against you? Or what does it mean if certain agencies are involved? You know, only if you have an inner understanding of their system, you can actually make a cold-headed decision about what's going on. So you have to prepare your decision-making process by really being able to orient yourself in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that is especially important for groups, I think, is there is this tendency of information loss. So you have one person that is observing something, and you have another person that observes something differently, but they never talk to each other. So they can never form a picture together and never put their observations into context. And they all come up with their own interpretations of what it means. Their orientation phase is disconnected. There's this, the story, with the blind man and the elephant, where the blind man, one blind man touches the tail, and says it's a rope, another one the foot, and says, oh, this is a tree, and nobody sees that it's an elephant, because they're actually not integrating their observations and don't put it into relationship with other knowledge that they have. And for groups, that is really important. And it's also important to prevent stuff like paranoia. It's very easy that, some person has an interaction with the opponent and thinks that everybody is doomed now, just because he was stopped 3 times in his car.
I think that's actually one of the biggest dangers for alternative groups is that they, at least in my experience, often oscillate between total naivety, where they, do not assess the risk at all, and then on the other hand, like total paranoia, which leads to basically not doing anything because you're always worried and you're always paranoid, and you come up with this like super time-consuming, elaborate protocols to try to protect yourself. Sometimes making it even more suspicious when you, only meet in the woods or something like that.
Or you're unable to actually have trust amongst each other. If you're paranoid enough, you won't have a group ever, because you think that everybody is a CIA agent.
True. Yeah, that happened also a lot, that if people get paranoid, they think everybody's a spy.
Yeah. And the fascinating thing is actually that it's a little bit of a self-defeating meme, actually. So, we have been through that process ourselves, and I'm not sure how often you have been accused of that, but I've been accused of that a lot, and I think that there's this thing that as soon as you're interested in understanding the other side and trying to outmaneuver them, then your knowledge of the other side is used as a sign that you are from the other side.
Sure. Yeah.
That's so stupid, essentially, if you're going the paranoia path, you will forever remain unable to maneuver, because you never know how to maneuver against an opponent that you know nothing about. In this context, it really makes sense to actually read Sun Tzu and The Art of War, and try to understand what that actually means, what he writes about. So, yeah. Let's go to the next one. The decision phase. What can you do against the opponent in a decision phase?
Well, you want to prevent that the opponent attacks you, ideally. Yes. So you can increase collateral damage. So that means...
What does it mean?
If they would attack you, that they also damage things they don't want to damage. Let's say in a war situation, if you're like in the middle of nowhere, they can just, drop a bomb on you. If you're like in a city, that also means that other people around you would be harmed.
Right.
In a more civilian setting, that means, for example, if you have very good relationships with your neighbors, or you even provide a service for them, like this soup kitchen, and somebody attacks you, that means that there are other people that are either harmed by the attack on you, or they're at least motivated to help you defend yourself. That's not collateral damage per se, but that's actually increasing the cost of an attack, making it harder.
Good point.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
Well, like you said before, for the first point, you should know the law, and if you know the law, that means you should actually prepare legal defense. You should, have a lawyer you can call. You should know if you're breaking any rules, what rules are you breaking, what the penalties would be for that, and how you would defend Don't.
So that means that if the attacker is going to decide to act against me, and I know about this decision, that I can, for example, call my lawyer and prepare legal action against the attacker.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or it might help that they know that you have a good lawyer.
True.
Yeah,
True. That helps a lot. I think the other thing that is often ignored is that you should reduce the profit that an attacker can make. So in a lot of security settings, you also have this constant play of costs of an attack versus profit of an attack on both sides. What's the cost of your defense? What's your loss if you fail to defend yourself? And on the attacker side, what is the cost of attacking? And if I'm successful with the attack, what is my profit from it? And in a criminal environment, for example, that's usually fully monetary, where it's only about if I'm successful with my attack, then I get €1 million, And on the defense side, it's if I'm unsuccessful with my attack, I lose €1 million and maybe one of my lieutenants, And that is the easiest thing to think about. But for example, if you're the target of an oppressive state, then the attack might not just be about finding money, I mean, of course that can happen, but there's stuff like they want convictions, they want to find evidence that they can use against somebody and then, put you in front of a TV camera and say this evil anarchist did this bad thing, and we can prove it, So reducing the profit they can make might include not just monetary profit, but profit for further investigations, convictions, media operations, photo operations.
Yeah, it's still profit, but often non-monetary. So
Yes.
Either for certain people, like you said, it might advance their careers if they make a big case. And I think a very important point is often the public image.
Yes.
So that you can see that with law enforcement all the time. If it's like this small, sweet girl gone missing, suddenly it's a huge case because it, got a lot of publicity. And if it's some homeless person, nobody cares. And it will not be prioritized. And it's the same if you, like what we already covered, if you have a lot of public support, then people are more hesitant, or law enforcement more hesitant to go after you, even if you're clearly doing something wrong.
Right. Especially if they run into the risk of not being able to show after the attack that they were right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing something very good and the public knows about it, then you're harassed by the police or whoever. And then afterwards, the police cannot even, point towards all the convictions they get. Then that is bad for the individual policeman even, and I mean, you can see the reverse in a little bit, with the Silk Road case, against Ross Ulbricht, because there was this high, profit that could be made by catching the guy,
Mm-hmm.
because, there was this huge, political will behind it and saying, okay, we have to find him to demonstrate to everybody that there's, no free market, that there's no anonymity, that there's, that the government is in control about what you trade. So, and that profit actually justified, so much in that case. It justified how much money they threw at it. That justified why, they broke their own laws, It justified why they had investigators that could get away with crime, basically, or for at least a while. And it probably even justified using technologies that are not allowed in law enforcement, at least officially, So it was this huge profit that they could make from a successful attack that helped a lot. And the other thing is when you see all the media coverage and propaganda they did in front of this case, where everybody was talking about, oh, the darknet is so bad, and bad drugs and red rooms, etc. So everybody was scared about these evil people in the darknet and the darknet markets. So, in a way, you can see the strategy of increasing the profit while lowering the potential collateral damage.
Yeah, and they also used, they manipulated the public view during the trial. I think this murder allegation that was basically evil genius.
Yes,
you could really see once they pulled that out, a lot of people who were not, in the know so much in the case, they immediately turned against him. And then later they dropped the allegations. They didn't prosecute him for that. But I think still to this day, this like, oh yeah, there was this hitman for hire allegation is still haunting him.
Yes.
Although it was never proven, it was never even part of the trial.
Yes.
And again, like it shows how important the public image is. Yes. And how it is manipulated also during trials or during investigations.
Yeah. Yeah, very correct. So it's important to keep this in mind, to keep in mind, increase the collateral damage of your attacker, reduce the potential profit by your attacker. And when it comes to these things, it's not just money, it's public image, it's individual careers, it's future political leverage. All these things play a big part there.
Yeah, and you could really nicely see how the personal motives of different actors work together. You had the senator who went public and said, okay, we really have to take this down. That meant that for all the investigators, the actual policemen, there was a lot of prestige to be gained when they find the guy. Then once they had him, the judge, there was a lot of political pressure on the judge, so the judge cannot be given like a light sentence. So all of them basically are working for their own career advancements, but pushing each other doing that.
And I think it also is a good warning for the failure of the observation orientation phase for darknet operators during that whole build up to the case, because I vividly remember people just making fun about the case, just saying, nobody will find the pirate, because Tor is so great and all our technology is so great and it's not really illegal what we're doing, and there was this complete misconception of abilities of the attacker on the one side, but also the legal environment in which everybody was operating. There was a lot of false security that people had, which led to more mistakes, and led to people being shocked when Cypher was actually taken down.
And also, I think often the ignorance of the ability of law enforcement to learn.
Yes.
So even if you come up with like this great technology that anonymizes your, let's say, your internet traffic like Tor, and you believe, okay, this is perfect, even if it would be perfect, that there's still a lot of other angles they're going to work over time. Try to trace the payments, try to trace actual packages. There's a ton of stuff you can work on over time.
Yes.
And they did that. And people usually ignore that. I think they're often too tech focused as well. That they think the attack, if the protection comes from the technology, that the attack will come through the technology, but the attack often comes through other angles, like human mistakes.
You kind of have to have this complete picture of your situation. You have to know all your processes, and you have to know all the methods of the opponent to actually form a real image of what kind of attack you're dealing with. And so, yes, we're calling back a little bit into the orientation phase, but if you're unable to keep your orientation operational, then the attacker is already in the position where you can decide without you actually being able to anticipate that he's already decisional, and that means that the attacker is already progressing in the OODA loop faster than you are, and if the attacker can act before you can act, you lost. It's simple as that.
Yeah. I think we covered most of the, on the attack side for the decision, but on the defense, we also covered most of it. It is good to have a lawyer on call, have a defense fund, have contingency plans, I
think the contingency plans are super critical. What happens if, you actually see that an attack is in progress, because it's a time, critical thing here, The real question is, can you be faster in the OODA loop than your attacker? So time is of the essence. And that means that for a lot of situations, you must have the plan on how to act before you know that you have to act. That basically shortens your decision phase dramatically. And that means that in a way you want to take the decision phase out of the OODA loop and you want to put it outside of the attack actually, and think about certain responses, and then if an attack happens, you know exactly what to do next, who's responsible ideally. There's no question about, this person in our organization is responsible for dealing with a lawyer, for example, or this person deals with the landlord and all that, or who's responsible to interact with media, who are the people we call, who are the journalists, who are the defense lawyers, who's the transport service provider and stuff like that, You kind of have to, ideally you want to just take a blueprint out of the desk, and say, okay, we're in this situation and we thought it through before. We know exactly who's going to do which step now, and you execute it immediately so that you have the speed advantage there.
It's a bit similar to what a lot of preppers do, that they have their bug out bag ready and they know, okay, there might be some, disaster of whatever form. And if that happens, they don't have the time to prepare for it. They just already prepared an exit. And if something happens, they just execute the plan.
Exactly.
And thereby have a much higher chance of actually making it.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that good thinking, good plans, require time. Thinking is slow. Good thinking is slow. And if you have to think too fast, then you introduce a lot of error and mistakes. So taking all the thinking out of the stress situation enables you actually to have better responses. Less mistakes, faster execution, etc. And you mentioned the preppers. There's another big player in the field that has contingency plans. That's the government itself. They have contingency plans for, what happens in a nuclear attack, what happens on a blackout. They have these plans and they rework those plans constantly. They have the same thing where they say, okay, we orient ourselves on the world by learning about the world and then put that information into their contingency planning. And then when something happens, they don't have to call the committee. It's not, 500 people deciding what to do next, but it's, oh yeah, this is file A3115 and we follow it step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And you also have the same thing with pilots, for example, when you're flying an aircraft. So for certain scenarios, you have the exact procedure how to react to it. You memorize it, plus you have it in the manual, and then the co-pilot reads it to the pilot or vice versa. I'm not the pilot. And they follow the procedure immediately. Because time is a really critical thing there. And it's specifically decision phase, and where time is actually all, So observation phase is not really time critical. Orientation phase is not time critical. If you're kind of good and on the same level of your attacker, you're about as fast, But when it comes to making decisions, that is where preparation is a real is a lever to everything you do. And the interesting thing is that if you're on the defensive, you often have an advantage in the decision phase because you know your territory better, you know your environment better, which means that you can have far more flexible contingency plans. And you can often execute them with less error, less mistakes. And in that specific moment, the defender is a little bit in the advantageous phase, which is different from the attack phase where it's reverse actually.
You can see a lot of these patterns also in medicine, where you often have these situations where the medical professionals, they have to act very quickly. And the way to do that is that you have, defined procedures for everything and you have clear responsibilities. I think you can see that also in the structure of organizations, that when the problem domain is actually time critical, you have more hierarchical structures, because you simply don't have the time to decide, let's say during operation. You cannot discuss, the surgeon cannot discuss with the anesthetics person to what procedure they should take. There must always be one person making the ultimate decision. It's the same for military. In a war situation, you cannot discuss things. And I think that's also something a lot of people have trouble with to adjust their mindset, because let's say you come from a startup, there's often it's good to take a lot of time and discuss things to find the best decision. But you only do that because you actually have more time.
Yeah. So, and if everything went wrong, we go to the attack.
Yeah. So that's the action phase, or the act phase, where an actual attack is happening. To make it harder for an attacker, you want basically have borders. You want to make it harder to go into your territory. You have access control, fences, and then there's a lot of things that you actually could do, but we don't want to do them.
Right, but I think we might want to talk about that a little bit, just in the hypothetical. Plus, maybe explain a little bit why borders and fences and access control are actually important. So, what do borders and fences do? Other than making observation harder, they also introduce a barrier, a delay, for the attacker. So, imagine that you have a door in your apartment that an attacker would need 5 minutes to open. That is 5 minutes where you know that the attack is happening, but you can prepare your defensive action, or execute defensive action already. So it's a certain time that you're buying yourself with having a barrier, a fence, something like that. So it allows you to have some time between detecting that an attack is happening and actually being confronted with the attacker directly. So, and it increases the cost of the attacker to actually reach you. So that is one of the big important parts of having fences and barriers.
It also removes a lot of ambiguity. I mean, even if let's say you have a house and you have a very low fence, that's easy to go over, but it is a very clear symbol to people coming to your house, and they know, okay, this is a fence. If I step over it, I clearly violate some boundary.
Yes.
And that's also important. It's also important for your observation. So you can be very sure that this is some form of intruder. You don't have to ask yourself, is this like somebody who just randomly walked the wrong direction once they passed like a physical barrier?
Yeah. So in a way, the barrier is not just important in the attack itself, but it's also important for the observation and for the orientation phase. So you having a barrier allows you to see that, or prevents somebody else to see what's going on. When they overstep the barrier, you can clearly see that. You can clearly orient because, it's not a random event. It's a targeted event. And it helps you with the decision in that moment because you have a very clear scenario where you can say, okay, when somebody goes through a barrier in the south, for example, then this is the next thing I can do. And then in the action phase, you have this delay factor that allows you to mount a defense, actually. And
you can also here, you can learn a lot from other organizations. You always have this setup. You have it, let's say, for military, for some barracks or some military station. You have it for factories. Factories usually have some form of perimeter defense, and they have a gate, and all the goods flowing in and out of the factory go through that gate, and are usually
it's a defined path.
Yeah, it's a defined path, and that prevents theft and makes it harder, for people to steal anything. And it's always this pattern, that you have some sort of fence border where usually nobody goes through, and then you have a defined path where people go through with certain forms of checks and security.
Which is your access control.
Yeah, exactly.
And in the context of the TAZ, access control is even more important because you might not actually know that an attack is underway if you don't have access control. So imagine you have a fence around your property and you have people that normally go in and out, but you don't know everybody going in and out. You would not actually be able to recognize if an attacker infiltrates your place already. So the attack might be long underway before you can react to it. So access control is really important. You have to make sure that only legitimate people can come in, and they can only come in a certain way. We should actually talk a little bit about method of access control later in the episode, because there's a lot to learn and a lot to play around with. On the defensive side, the activities that we can take are relatively limited because we're, at least here, we're more dedicated to not being very violent. We don't want to end up in a standoff. We don't want to harm anybody, actually, because that undermines our goals and values. So depending on your own situation, you execute your contingency plans at that moment. You call your lawyer, you call the media, you call your friends, so you're not alone. And then you do something that is very specific for temporary autonomous zones, and that is you give up the zone, you move.
Yeah, that's the ultima ratio of TAZs. That's actually where the temporary comes from. So the temporary is not so much being temporary in time, but it's about being temporary in space. So you're at a certain location, and if you failed in the previous phases, if a conflict escalated so much that you're running out of options, the ultima ratio, the last option you have is you move. You have to go to a different location.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us back to this contingency plan. You kind of have to plan that from the very start. You have to be prepared to move. And that has a lot of implications for how you build your temporary autonomous zone.
Yeah. I think it's really important to put an emphasis on the move as a defensive action. Because a lot of people, when they think about conflict, they are dragged into this, we have to have a standoff with the opponent. And especially if you are a liberty-loving anarchist, a standoff will potentially be with an opponent that is far stronger than you. And you might run into real trouble there. you don't have a chance. Let's be realistic here. Even if you're a group of American gun-toting, liberty-loving militiamen in the depth of Montana, if you really piss off the U.S. government, you're done with.
Yeah, even if you have no moral problems.
Even if you had no moral problems, you'd be done with.
Yeah, you have no chance.
Exactly. So the standoff is basically never being able to act again, So you're not going to repeat the OODA loop another time, another place. You're not going to repeat it ever again, So planning for a standoff is planning for ultimate failure. That is what you do.
I just had this idea that there's some interesting correlation to what are actually the organizations that are successful against, like, for example, the US government. These are usually they employ guerrilla tactics.
Yes.
And
highly fluid.
They don't have a certain location. If you have a fixed location, you have no chance.
Yeah.
So that's basically how they can be so relatively successful given the huge power imbalance.
Yes, they stay hidden in a certain degree.
Yeah,
they have ambiguity in their activities, so it's hard to pinpoint them, and they don't let themselves be dragged into standoff scenarios.
Yeah, because in a direct conflict, you have no chance against
not the slightest
nation-state militaries.
And even, let's scale it down a little bit because we're not really about fighting the government. That's not our thing. Our thing is to live free. And our opponents are often not police or whatever, because if we do everything right, they never care about us. But our real issue might be something like criminal gangs. If you're operating a successful temporary autonomous zone with a lot of commercial activity, you're a target. And you're a target for criminals. So are you really thinking about having a standoff with, let's say, the Hells Angels? It's something that none of us really wants to do, because in the end, we want less violence in our life, not more violence in our life. If there's a way we can limit violence on both sides and still continue doing what we want to do, that is the real option. We want peace, we don't want war. And if you're able to structure it correctly, then the movement or the fleeing is actually a good option. A lot of people think that fleeing is a bad option. Because they think, you will lose face and you will lose your capital and you lose everything, by fleeing. But the loss that you suffer when you move away, when you run away, is really a result of not being prepared for it. If you're always prepared to move, when all the capital is liquid enough or movable enough, then you don't lose the capital. If your cultural code is to escalate conflict only to a certain point and then to disappear, there's no dishonor in that. Instead of being a chicken that runs away, you actually have figured out that using the concept of escalating OODA loops, you discovered something, and that is when you move away, your attacker has to change as well. You might just move 100 kilometers further into a different city or a different state or maybe a different country, and at that moment, your attacker has to adapt to it. And you might actually find out, because most of these attackers are territorial, is that they don't actually want to follow you. Because in their mind, they have solved the problem. You're gone.
Mm.
And the new attackers in the new territory, remember, it's a territorial issue that we are talking about here. The new attackers will start with the escalating conflict anew. They start very low again. That gives you a lot of time where you can actually have freedom in a certain space then move to a different space when it gets too hot and continue having freedom, and if all your structures, plans, technologies are meant for moving fast and cheap, then that is a strategy that you can follow easily. And you don't run into that problem of always risking losing everything, including your capital, your liberty, and maybe even your life.
I mean, the entire US wouldn't exist if it wouldn't be for people who ran away.
Exactly. And I think it's true for most developed countries, actually, that they're mostly a mixture of people that over the centuries or millennia both moved away from things that were bad and also moved towards things that were better,
And I think a lot of people actually died because they were too attached to a territory and the capital they had bound up there. And so they didn't run away quickly enough.
Yeah. Or ran towards new opportunities quickly enough.
Yeah. Okay, so we basically have the concept of a TAZ, temporary autonomous zone. Like what we said, we have to be able to move eventually, and that has a lot of implications. So what would be important factors to consider when thinking about a TAZ?
So keep in mind, a TAZ is a physical space. We want to have certain environments. We want to have infrastructure. We want to have spaces to meet. And essentially, for most people, that means you have something like a house. But houses are really hard to move. I mean, it happens from time to time that houses are moved, but it's really expensive and usually not a good idea. So what you really want to have in a TAZ concept is that you can build the infrastructure of your place in a highly mobile way. And I'm not going to have a big cliffhanger here and make you wait, but for us, thinking about this concept really meant that we wanted to create a space that is both a space and a movable space, and the movable space is containers. And then the next question is, what exactly do you put into those containers? You know that you want this space for certain functions, like, for example, you want to meet people, or you want to exchange goods, or you want to party, or whatever else you do in the space, maybe even live there. And if you can adapt that to the concept of shipping containers that are easy to move, then you basically has the recipe for a temporary autonomous zone that is only temporary in space, but not in time.
Yeah, the reason for shipping containers is basically that the entire transport industry has standardized on them. So it's the cheapest way to transport like goods, and also the structure that is wrapped around those goods, like, namely the shipping containers. And they have a lot of advantages over things like RVs, for example. So you can stack them. That means
good point.
If you have some property, you need less property because you can go in the third dimension basically. And
yes, you don't have the flat space only in which to operate, but you stack it. Like, that's the reason people build high rises, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you optimize your ground area, and which makes the property rent or the property price cheaper. And you have the maybe one could put it that way. You have the transport infrastructure not part of the container itself.
Yes. Like with an RV, you pay for the motor, you pay for the tires and on the undercarriage and all the stuff. And with a container, you basically only pay for the hull.
Exactly. And for the RV, it only makes sense to pay for all of that if you use it a lot. So if you're moving all the time, that makes total sense. But with the TAZ, the idea is that we only have to move in case of conflict, and the last, the ultima ratio.
Yeah.
And that means we don't move a lot. So if you would have all that transport infrastructure always there would be a ton of bound capital. So,
that also requires maintenance and all these things.
Exactly. You can see that a lot in these, do you know the English term?
Wagenbogen.
Bauwagenplätze.
Yeah. I don't know what the actual term is.
But it's not just RVs, also these construction cars.
Yeah.
So it's basically like a small house on wheels. But you can see that a lot on these places that the movability of the structures actually breaks down over time because they stand there for so long that the tires, they rot, and the main, like you said, it would require a lot of maintenance, and people usually don't do the maintenance. So things start rotting away. And when they actually have to move, then they have to figure out a way how to do it.
Right. And I think the combination actually of having this mobile container, but also the stackability allows you so much interesting things. So for example, if you have a TAZ that is owned by a lot of people, so people own individual containers, for example, it's very easy to restructure them, to repurpose the container in a different location, move the container out, ship it to somewhere else, or within the same location, change the order of the containers if you have an internal conflict, or if you just want to change the architecture or stuff like that. So the shipping container is a really interesting building block into which we can put our vision of a TAZ. So what do you want in a TAZ as functions, for example?
Just for the building block, I just had this idea that the container is basically the Lego brick of cypherpunks.
Yes.
So, or crypto anarchist. That's how you construct your physical reality. What was your question? What functions do we want to have?
Yeah. What function would you put into a TAZ in a container?
Like immediate ideas or like full blown?
Start with what is necessary for a minimum TAZ.
Minimum TAZ. I would say.
How many containers do you need?
One.
What do you do in this container?
Well, I mean, maybe we can tell the story a little bit how we started. We basically started off with 2 containers. We had one 40-foot and one 20-foot, which we got used and relatively cheaply. And I think the reasoning was immediately that we figured, okay, if we build out the 40-foot, we need to put the stuff to build it out with somewhere. So we need the 20-foot for just storage.
So you have to start with 2 containers, actually.
Okay, you kind of have to. Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah. So we built out the first container to be a meeting room / hackerspace. So we have a little area in the 40-foot for electronic works and stuff like that. And also a central part, which is mostly about sitting and drinking and talking, I think.
Yeah, but I think the earliest problem you have is you want to create like more habitable space than a shipping container.
Insulation.
So that means insulation.
Yeah.
So,
lighting.
Insulation, lighting, and ventilation. And then very quickly afterwards, electricity.
Yes.
And then you basically, do we cover heating? You want heating? And then you basically created a room.
Exactly.
And then you can do everything that you can do with a room, except for toilet and shower.
Yes. So what it really gives you is a room that is movable. Yeah. You can have it in a certain place. You can use it for meetings. You can use it for work. You can lock it, of course. And then if anybody ever finds out that there's a trouble in that space, it's the wrong people meeting, then you take the thing and move it to another place and you repeat. And the interesting thing with shipping containers is if you paint them correctly, then it is extremely hard to attribute them. It's really hard to find a shipping container again. There's no number plate recognition for shipping containers. They all look the same. I mean, if you've ever come by an industrial zone where there are a few stacks of shipping containers, you know that you can hide another one in there pretty quickly. So the first container you basically build is a meeting space.
Yeah.
Okay. And we continued by adding a gym into the 20-foot containers, which is not used enough apparently, and is still mostly a storage space at this point.
That changed a few times, I think, what we did with the 20-foot. But yeah, the gym was one use case.
But right now we're working on several other shipping containers. We built them out special purpose. And one of the things that is really close to my heart is to have a place where people can actually live for a little while, where you can receive guests or sleep yourself for a night or two, where you have, a quiet, warm room to rest your head and have a toilet and a shower, so that you can actually, for a moment, disappear in a container TAZ.
Exactly. And that's basically, I think I would abstract it as everything that has to do with water. So if you want to sleep somewhere, if you want to live somewhere longer, you kind of need to solve the toilet problem, and you need to solve the hygiene problem. So you need to be able to shower or wash yourself. But you need to be able to cook and deal with that. But that's easier once you have water.
But that is more the technical aspect. The functional aspect for me is this ability to have a place where you can live.
Yeah.
And a place where you can extend hospitality to friends and stuff like that.
Yeah, but what I meant is like, if you want to take a room where you can, meet, to a room where you can live, you need to solve this problem.
True.
That's the fundamental next step. Once you have heating, electricity, insulation,
True.
You kind of need to solve toilets and showers.
Yes. Now the next functional step that we're working on is a more surveillance protected container, where the meetings that you have are actually protected against third-party intelligence gathering, let's call it like that. So we're thinking about, or worked on that already, to turn a container into a Faraday cage, where you don't have, electromagnetic waves cannot get out of the container. There's also work on anti-recording technology that we're going to put into that. So a voice masking system is one of the things we're working on, which would allow you to have conversations that cannot be recorded by a third party, and where microphones are jammed and stuff like that.
Yeah, because there are basically two ways how to approach the problem of you not wanting to be recorded when you have a conversation. One is that you make sure that the room you're in is totally bug-free.
Yeah.
And is also not, bugged from far away. So things like when you have these laser
microphones,
laser microphones that can read speech from a window. And this approach, of keeping a room bug-free, is extremely hard.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is what you can, to some degree, pull off if you run an agency, like an embassy, sorry. If you run an embassy, but you basically have to make sure that the building or the room is bug-free starting from construction, and then you have to have 24/7 very tight access control and regularly sweep it. And so that's extremely hard. And so the much easier approach, in my opinion, is that you have active countermeasures in a room that is relatively secure. What you mentioned, you have this Faraday cage, but for voice, you would have active voice masking.
Yeah. So basically it generates a lot of random voices that are overlaid to the conversation that the people have, and you yourself have a headphone where you hear the clear conversation. And the other method is jamming microphones, which basically uses ultrasound to prevent a microphone from actually functioning properly mechanically. And that would give you as a TAZ operator actually a place where you can have actual private conversations, where you can be pretty sure that they're not recorded by a third party. And then another thing that we're working on is more like a bar area, which might be more important for other people that run TAZs. They might want the bar before they want the surveillance-free room. For us, it's kind of vice versa. So a bar place would allow you to have social interaction in the room much better. Just meet for a drink doesn't always have to be business-centric. Just have a social place to hang out. And ideally 24/7, so that if you want to meet liberty-minded people, okay, there's this TAZ and they have a bar that you can go to, or a cafe you can go to. Or if you want to meet somebody for business, that you can hang out there and wait and do your business. And such a place doesn't have to be necessarily a big professional operation. So for us, for example, the idea is more to operate it out of vending machines. So have vending machines where you can get your drinks and whatever, and then have a seating area where you can enjoy yourself and your drink.
And you mentioned vending machines. Similar thing I would really love to have is storage boxes, locker boxes.
Safe deposit boxes.
Yeah. So basically a system where you have safe deposit boxes in different sizes that you can rent. Also short-term and long-term. Of course, with an anonymous digital payment system and the ability to transfer ownership of these boxes to other people.
Yeah, right now we have to exploit the IKEA store, which is close by, where they have 24 hours lockers that are controlled by a PIN code. So you can store stuff there and then give the other party the location and the PIN code to transfer your goods. But you really want to have that in a TAZ in a more convenient way.
And you mentioned sleeping there, and ideally I would like to have a bunch of capsule pods where like a capsule hotel where you can also, again, with your anonymous digital currency or payment system, you can just rent a capsule to crash in and sleep after a night of talking and hacking and whatever in the bar and in the private space. You can just check out in the capsule hotel.
Yeah, and then there's of course always the famous trading room. So in a more crypto-anarchistic setup, we cannot rely on calling the police when something goes wrong during business. And trading rooms are constructions that allow two parties to meet and exchange goods without the parties being able to defraud each other easily. So, for example, they prevent a party from just running away without paying, or you can build them in a way there where the parties don't have to meet face to face. They don't have to see each other and still be able to enforce that the business deal is going to be completed. And you can do that physically. Also, for certain businesses, you want to reduce the ability to commit crime, violent crime against people. So there's this container that I personally want to build, which is hijacking an idea where you have basically two rooms in a container, and the one room leads to the outside, and the other room contains the remote control for this outside door, and that can enforce that if two people meet there, that you can always make sure that both people are still alive and well, or they cannot leave that construct at all. And if you have these components, basically you have a community space, you have a bar or restaurant or cafe, you have basic sanitation, you have a place to trading rooms, you have your locker system or safe deposit box system, and ideally a capsule hotel. You actually build something like a real little world. You know, it's a little bit like the core functionality of a crypto anarchist village that fits into a couple of shipping containers, and that, given proper barriers, fencing, etc., can turn this thing into an experiential and productive space.
Yeah, exactly. It would be some sort of crypto anarchy village. Sorry, crypto anarchy village. In my dream setup, I would also add some sort of different zones. So you would have the more public zone where the bar is, where people from the outside can go into, and I would also have basically like the citizen area or the member area where people who permanently live there, or
in their own containers,
where
they can work.
Or the people who have a business there, that only they can access.
Yes.
So you would have so it's basically like a marketplace, which is more public, and then the private areas. Maybe we should paint like the entire picture a bit, in more detail. So the way I kind of dream about it's like that, you go to this place, which is built out of containers. The entire perimeter is basically containers. It's multiple stories high.
And from the outside, it just looks like a stack of containers.
Yeah, it looks like a stack of containers. And you basically have one or two, or maybe even three, but some entrances. But you go like through the public entrance, which is in itself, it's a container with two doors on both sides, and inside is the access control system. And you would have some locker boxes, which you could use to store all the stuff you're not allowed to take into the TAZ,
like recording devices, mobile phones, etc.
And you would basically have some form of ATM where you could buy the digital currency that is used inside, and then you go in. So you basically, you drop the stuff you're not allowed to take in. You get let's say a digital wallet from a vending machine. You load it up, and you get a day pass, and then you go through the access control system, which it's a bit like these systems in an airport where only one person can go through at a time. And and then you enter, and then you have like this bar area with vending machines where you can buy drinks and sit down. You would have other storage boxes where you could store stuff more long term or short term. You might meet somebody in like this private area to have a conversation which is not recorded. You might do a trade in the trading room. You can go to the capsule hotel and sleep there. You can go to the co-working space and work there. And basically, once you enter, you're in a different world.
Yes,
and you can actually stay there for a very long time if you want to. Take a shower, go to the toilet, or the basic things too, of course, and basically enter like this alternative cyberpunk reality, which gives you a lot more freedom, and that freedom is basically built with high tech and shipping containers.
Yes, and how low the life there is depends on on how far you go with money and whatever you put into the construction.
And what I also like about this concept is that I think if one builds it right, it could be operated with just one person being there at a time.
True, but I think the long-term vision is actually that you always want people there.
Of course.
Not just like outsiders coming in for business, but people that actually live there. And that's one of the other things that I really like about shipping containers is I can have my own shipping container that is set up for living in it. It's my house, basically. Or maybe it's not just one shipping container, but 4 shipping containers, because I like all the luxury that the space brings. And I can be in the temporary autonomous zone with my shipping containers, live there permanently. I basically rent 3D coordinates where to put my boxes. And if I do that and a few other people do it, it's basically like a village. It's not just a clubhouse that you go to, but it's a village. It's a permanently different sphere. And in a way, it's an intentional community that you're forming there, but with a few more realistic assumptions on how those communities work. Because instead of having a community that is owned by everybody in the same share, you basically only own your own containers, and you agree on the rules of the place. And if the rules change or you change and you cannot agree with the rules anymore, you just pack up your shipping containers and go to a different TAZ, So there's actually a model there for competing legal structures where different TAZs can have different rules, or where a single TAZ can have multiple zones with different rules. And you can take your living space and move into those zones of different rules, which also helps us to experiment with different legal systems and with different social groupings, because in the end, anarchy is also about being able to select whom you're with, and this awareness that rules are dominantly a form of social ordering. You need the rules because there are multiple people. That is why we come up with rules. But if you're able to easily switch between groups and between rules, then we can actually find out which rules are the best, for us at least, or maybe for certain communities, or who knows how many people. So, and that is another thing that TAZs really can present, is this ability to find out what better rules are, and not on a global scale, but on an individual scale, and also realize that a lot of conflicts come from this territorial thinking. You have your property and it's unmovable, and your neighbor has property and it's immovable as well. And you and your neighbors don't get along, then you already have a conflict where there's no real good solution, because everybody can only lose. But if your property is mobile, you just take your property, and move over 100 meters, and the conflict is solved. You don't have to interact with your neighbor anymore. No reason, to stare at each other's face all the time. So in a way, this concept of autonomous zones on the one hand, but also this space temporarity of your capital, of your building, allows you to reduce conflicts, plus experiment a lot with what rules and groups work best. And this can be both in one TAZ as well as in many TAZs.
Yeah, it makes moving to a different TAZ also a lot easier.
Exactly.
So it's like the normal concept of moving is very expensive, and it's a lot of work. You have to find a new apartment and a new location. You have to transfer all your stuff. You have to get rid of the old one, instead of just taking the entire thing with you.
Exactly.
And it also makes it much easier to gradually build up your capital and adjust your living space to your actual requirements.
Yes, you just add a new container when you have the money for it.
Yeah, or like the common situation that people get kids and then suddenly they don't have enough rooms and then they need a new apartment instead of just adding one more room. What you would do with containers, you get just one more container. And that also means because you can start so small that people could actually start building out their or building up their own capital much earlier. It's conceivable that when you're still learning, when you're still a student, that you start building your first container and live in it instead of always renting stuff.
This is where a lot of this tiny house movement comes from. For relatively little money, especially because you don't buy property, but only build this tiny house that is movable. You start basically building your house while you're still in school, and you extend it and you make it better. And then you take it to wherever you go to college, and then you take it wherever your first job is. And this allows you to get out of this continuous debt spiral that a lot of people are captured in. So the problem, however, with the tiny houses is that, they're not stackable. It's really hard to make efficient communities out of them. And doing that with containers means you have a much more efficient way of using area, and you still can build communities with them.
Yeah, and finally, a lot of the problems that tiny house people have is that they're all always fighting with building codes.
Yes.
I mean, that's, I would say, maybe wrongly, but I would say 50% of tiny house movement is basically trying to work around building codes, which is a great example of how inefficient the state system is. How inefficient it makes everything. You try to work around these building codes to find a better, cheaper solution. And in a TAZ, you hopefully you're able to just ignore a lot of these codes,
at least for a long enough while to make it viable.
Yeah,
exactly.
Which means you have a much greater opportunity to experiment with different structures.
Exactly. Maybe we should say one or two things about the access control, because this is actually something that for us is currently something where we think a lot about, be it for, having meetups at the TAZ 0, where we invite people, or, later if the whole space becomes a little bit bigger. There are a few important aspects for access control. Number one is you want people to only be in places where they're allowed to be. We're talking about private property here. So that means that you want your guests, to be in the public spaces, but not necessarily in the closed off spaces that are only for members. So that is one thing where access control is important for. But the much more important thing is you don't want 20 or 30 attackers to be able to get into your property through the front door at the same time, So you want to slow them down there, you want to see, okay, there's a line of people outside, and they all wear the same uniform, that might be an issue, you don't want them to be able to come in all at once. So access control is for slowing down people, but it's also for selecting people. And only then you can kind of automate the border defense, because that is what we're talking about. We're talking about having a territory, and you have a certain kind of border towards the outside world. And the access control system is really for that, So it means that, for example, people that you invite to the place, they get this access code with which they can enter the place, and some attacker doesn't get the same, doesn't get the code, and you change the code frequently enough and update the people that are on your roster, to make sure that, information leakage or something like that has, less of an impact, in a way, you want to force the attacker to infiltrate your organization before he can infiltrate your property.
And ideally, you would like to have, it is some sort of identity system where you, a person visiting the place, it has some sort of identity, and then the access rights are attached to that identity. But ideally, you would like to have a system where this identity is not permanent.
Yes.
And you still keep these access rights over time. And you also need the ability to kick people out again.
Yes.
So
what you
ideally
really,
also without permanently identifying them.
Exactly. You want an anonymous, untraceable identification system with biography,
Which sounds like
something we work on. Yes.
Sounds like it's impossible.
I'm pretty sure it is possible, but we're working on it. So it's actually one of the projects that we have here in the TAZ 0 is to create protocols that allow that. Okay. Anything else you would like to add to our topic of the day?
All right. Then it's time for our statistics part again. Thanks again to all our listeners who donated us some cryptocurrency. As always, we report the donations in the amount of the currency that we get the most donations for. In this case, it was Bitcoin again. We got 3.11 millibitcoin in Bitcoin, and we also got another 1.29 millibitcoin in Bitcoin Cash. Thank you guys for supporting us. We also calculated again how much that was in terms of the minimum wage in Germany. So this time we made 28.5% of the German minimum wage.
So we better apply for Social Security now.
If trends continue like that, last time we made 47.5%, this time 28.5%. If trends continue, we soon will starve.
So that either means that everybody is really cheap or our product is really bad. So...
Or the episodes are coming too quickly.
Or the episodes are coming too quickly.
So next episode, end of 2020.
Yeah, end of 2020 is probably a good choice. I mean, dear listener, please communicate to us, both in words and in coins, how you like our product and what you would like to hear in the future. And we actually had a few people writing in.
Yeah, so please write us to bitstream@taz0.org, and we got a few people who wrote us questions. We're gonna start off with one guy who is a young man currently studying IT and not having a lot of costs to cover, and so he has some free time, would like to work for Crypto Anarchy, and has some questions there. So do you have any advice for young people like me? Basically IT people just starting out very young, having no costs right now.
I think there are two things that everybody should think about. And that is, number one, raise your inner entrepreneur. I think that is one of the most important things you can do in the early stages of Crypto Anarchy is to figure out how to run your own business, how to create value in the world without breaking your moral code. That is, I think, a really good advice, The other thing is, I think that a lot of people are too focused on tech and too little focused on people. And I think it's really important to build social connections, have friends that are crypto anarchists, and work together.
Yeah, I agree. I think fundamentally there are only two ways how to make money. And one is you convince people to give it to you voluntarily, and the other one is you take it by force. And if you're a crypto anarchist, you can only do it by convincing people to give it to you voluntarily. And that always means you have to offer them something, which is usually a product or service that they want to have. And in order to be able to do that, you need in its skills, and you have to develop those skills over time. So my advice would be focus on building these valuable skills, which like programming, software development is one of them. And like you said, also don't ignore the human aspect. And probably the best way how to develop that is to find like-minded people and start building something with them. Could be a software project, could also be just building out a container or something. And don't be afraid to fail. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Just do something, and do even more, and eventually you get good at it. And
most success is actually repeating after failure.
You just repeat all the time, trying to build something valuable, and eventually you end up there. And like you said, I mean, the entrepreneur mindset, it's really, I think a lot of people criticize capitalism. They totally get it wrong because they think, okay, capitalist is just focusing on the money. But if you actually want to be successful in a free market economy, you don't focus on the money. You have to focus on how can you provide value for other people.
Exactly.
That should be your focus. And there's a lot of very low-hanging fruits that you can take in order to provide value for people. If you're able to build out shipping containers, would be one of them.
Indeed.
Yeah. So
not as necessarily the high skill domain for IT people, though.
Yeah, but a good hobby, even if you're in IT. Okay, the second question, or the second few more questions we have is more technical. So, how do you disable Intel ME?
By not running an Intel processor. And not running an AMD processor because they have something similar. So there are a few interesting ARM-based systems out there right now. Also, you should look at Chromebooks. They come without Intel Management Engine. Then you can get the older Lenovo X220 series, for example. You can reflash the BIOS and actually remove the ME loader. So that is the way to go. We've done that here at the container a few times. You just need a BeagleBone Black and a few software components and a few adapters, and you can reflash the BIOS with Core Boot or Libre Boot, and that basically gives you what you want. Another really important thing is try not to have Intel network interfaces. So it's not just the BIOS that counts, but also, where's your Wi-Fi card from and where's your network card from.
Yeah, you want ideally you want physical separation, and you need the right hardware, so you don't need to use like some weird binary blobs there, right?
Yeah. Plus that the Intel ME is highly integrated with the Intel networking hardware. So if you use a different brand there, you don't have the integration.
Our next question was if the default encryption of virtual memory in OpenBSD is not enough.
So OpenBSD virtual memory is speaking about the swap space there. That is enough for everything. So you can actually choose between Twofish and AES for encryption, or Blowfish and AES. That should always be enough. The key there is ephemeral. It's created on boot by the kernel. So that's enough against analyzing the swap space.
But you should also activate the disk encryption for the other partitions, of course.
Right. So
which is relatively easy these days.
Yes. So
in OpenBSD.
OpenBSD always encrypts the swap space, but doesn't have full disk encryption by default. But enabling that, as you said, is relatively easy. And it must be.
Yeah, it's in the FAQ, I think. What about Libre Boot?
Big fan. I like Libre Boot where it runs. basically LibreBoot is a distribution of the coreboot OpenBIOS implementation. Look at all the coreboot variations there are. There are things like hats, for example, that are really interesting because they allow attestable boots with a little hardware token that works on Purism, for example.
And that's basically what you would run on an X220 with disabled Intel ME. You would also run something like LibreBoot.
Yeah, there are some bigger commercial vendors out there. So, for example, Purism is using coreboot as well. So you don't have the Intel shit backdoors there. System 76 is selling laptops and I think actually desktops with relatively modern hardware without Intel ME. Then there is PC Engines for routers that runs coreboot, and the Chromebooks.
They run on AMD, right?
No, there are Intel chips as well.
I mean AMD architecture. The processor, AMD 64. It's the architecture.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And Chromebooks. Chromebooks are a big thing there. So if you get a Google Chromebook, that actually comes without Intel Management Engine.
Cool. I have nothing to add there. We got another listener writing in, and he has something he asks about the store value discussion we had shortly last episode, and that Smuggler mentioned that is not important as a store value, and he's wondering how we actually create a store value then, because we don't really have real corporations in the second realm with shareholders and dividends, and as long as we don't have these productive investments as in the first realm, we're too dependent on governments for wealth preservation, and he sees BTC as a possible store value that can partially mitigate the problem, and it would be interesting to have such an unseizable bad day fund.
Well, I agree on the unseizable bad day fund, but we had that more or less before. So the interesting thing with Bitcoin is that access to Bitcoin relies on knowledge of the private key. But that's not the only kind of value storage that depends on knowledge. So a very classical example is that people store shares of corporations, like the physical printed shares, in safe deposit boxes where only they know where the safe deposit box is. So that's a classical example, because most shares you have in a publicly traded corporation you can get them on paper, and there's a little thing that you can cut off that gives you the part of the dividend for that year. So that is how shares actually work. So you can have them physically, and you can store them in non-attributed safe deposit boxes. It's a classical way of doing that. Another one is gold. You can bury gold in a place where nobody else knows where it is. The world is a really big place, so hiding gold is actually not that difficult if you know how to do it. If you're interested, there's a CIA manual on caching, which is good for initial inspiration on how to store valuables in public places, so they're extremely hard to find. Even if you have somebody running around with a metal probe, there are places that are very invulnerable to being detected, and where you can store value for a long time. You can also store cash to a certain degree. Of course, you have inflation depending on the currency. That's always a risk. But cash can be, and has been historically, stored for a long time against Caesar. There are people that put cash into Ziploc bags, and bury it, and there are always these cases, of grandmas dying, and then somebody finds like $500,000 in small bills under the mattress or something like that. So there are enormously many ways on how to store value in a way that is hard to access, hard to find by a third party, and where the ability of access relies on knowledge mostly. So you can have that in the non-Bitcoin world as well, but it requires more effort. Bitcoin makes it extremely easy to have knowledge accessible funds.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the idea of having gold as a store of value, like physical gold coins you actually possess, not some paper gold. Because you don't have the inflation problem so much like you have with fiat bills. You don't have, it's much more sturdy. It's kind of relatively easy to make sure that the gold coins are real. And like you said, you can actually hide them pretty well. And you can create you can put a significant amount of wealth into a relatively small amount of gold. I'm a bit critical is maybe the wrong word. Unconvinced about the store value properties of Bitcoin, given the fluctuations we see. I don't really see how that is a store of value when your value goes down by.
Well, it's the store of some value, I mean, it's really a question of what your definition of store value really is, For me, the definition of store of value is to maintain purchasing power over time. That is what store of value is. So you want something that has a similar or higher purchasing power in the future.
True. But for me, that future it can be far away in the future,
or it can be very short.
Yeah.
So price fluctuations are an issue there.
And systematic risk. I mean, I'm relatively sure that, let's say I have a bunch of gold coins, that there will be some value in 20 years. With fiat, there's systemic risk.
Yes. It will be half of it.
Yeah. Or nothing. But with Bitcoin, there's basically, I see everything between no value at all and 100x.
Yes.
So, can all be possible.
Exactly. So it depends really on your risk profile. And the interesting thing is when you look at the shares of companies, I wouldn't consider them store of value either, because a lot of companies don't actually exist for that long. If you really look into how long companies, even big companies, exist and how much value they have, you will be highly disappointed that a lot of, big players 20 years ago don't even exist anymore today.
Sure.
Like companies that were blue chips back then, are penny stock today. And so the environment is highly fluctuating. And I think that when it comes to preserving value, there's really one thing only that matters. And that is you have to take care of it. There's nothing like a passive store of value. I mean, hidden gold coins to a certain degree, but in almost everything else, it requires testing and maintaining your store.
Yeah, I agree. A second part of the question, though, was it's not just about store value, but about investments. So something that gives you interest, basically.
Yeah.
And I think he's right that we don't really have figured that out yet in the second realm.
We haven't.
I mean, there are some interesting things like cryptocurrencies where you do some staking and then you get you get some payout on the staked coins. But of course that also depends. You get an interest in terms of the cryptocurrency, but the cryptocurrency fluctuation itself still remains, which is unclear how it will develop. And
Well, I think it really depends. So how you define the second realm, how far you define it. You can today invest in companies relying only on general common law principles, or on very long running legal traditions that actually don't have much to do with the state, because having a share in a company is one thing. Having a participation in their profit is potentially a different thing. So it's a contractual agreement that you can have, or you can have a title agreement. The title agreement kind of requires the state to operate. The contractual agreement only requires that you have some form of enforcement. So you can today have participation in companies by only using free market arbitration. It's actually a very common thing when you're talking about big money business. They don't necessarily rely on the state courts. They have arbitration agreements and arbitration agencies there. So that already exists, because especially when you're talking about international business, relying on a single state's legal system doesn't work, or doesn't work that well. So one probably has to widen the scope a little bit on how we think about investments. We're very used to this relatively passive way of, just buying shares, and relying on a title transfer there, more or less. But there's also, loans, credits, stuff like that are contractual relationships that have not much to do with the first realm in the first place.
Yeah, especially what you mentioned with loans, I think it's a huge opportunity also for the second realm.
Yes.
For example, building out a TAZ means you need containers. Containers need to be financed. Some people have money to invest, so they could buy containers, rent them out, or give loans for containers for other people who pay the loan back with interest, and basically backed by the container itself. One could come up with schemes like that are basically similar to real estate, but on a much smaller scale and with less regulation. Cool. I think we covered that question. You had one other question?
Yeah, Zeddy wrote in, and he's asking, why should the state actually allow things like TAZs to exist?
Good question. I think it goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning of the episode. It's mostly it's about incentives. So why shouldn't he? Why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't the state not allow something like that to exist?
Because you're breaking the law.
Yeah, but most people break the law every day, right? The US, I think there's this book, 3 felonies a day, that you basically break the law 3 times a day, every American citizen. So, that's not the real issue. The real issue is, okay, will the law breaking will there be some enforcement? And that's where incentives come in. Does the state have an incentive to enforce the law in your special case? And to what degree can you prevent that from happening?
Yeah. Well, I would actually start earlier. That is, the state doesn't see everything all the time. So if what you're doing is hidden enough, then there is no state that can do anything about it, because it doesn't know anything about it. So if you're relatively smart in what you're doing and how public you do it, how well you select people, etc., then the state might not ever get involved in the first place. And then, as you said, the second question is, will they actually enforce something against you? That has, all the things we talked about with the OODA loop, with collateral, with how much profit you could make, how much an attack could cost, if you can escape such an attack, etc. So, in a way, the state has to have an incentive to attack you. And that incentive is very practical because there are people involved, there's money involved, there's alternative things they have to deal with, and they're low on resources most of the time. So it's often enough to not being the most profitable and cheapest to attack target. You don't want to be easy to attack. You don't want to give too much reason to be attacked. And then you can get away with a lot of things for a long time.
It's a bit like the story with the bear. Like when you're running away from this animal, you don't have to run out the
bear.
Bear. You have to run out the
other dude,
the slowest guy.
Yeah.
Don't be the slowest guy. I think it also depends. On the one hand, it depends in the general environment you're in. So if there are a lot of troublesome groups, let's say, if the general environment is unstable, the government has a lot of things to do already. So that would be an advantage. And the other is that general technological developments actually making it easier, for example, to hide what you're doing, or just creating a lot of instability just through technological change that the government has to adjust to. And I think that actually is something what we can already see that will help the strategy of TAZs.
Yeah. And I think there's another thing to keep in mind, and that is we often phrase what we do as an opposition to the state. And I think it's really important to consider what we do as different levels of alternatives to the state system. So the moment you start attacking the state, he will, bite back, if you, whatever bad thing you can do against the state very visibly, you will get a response from that, but I think the opposition against the state is relatively futile. It's not what we really need. That's what the revolutionaries already do and the reformers already do. They're opposed to whatever there is. And I think for us, it's so much more important to be an alternative. And alternatives are often an attractive thing for states to have. Sometimes states even want stuff like what we do, because it's creating something like a pressure valve. It keeps conflict from getting too big and too hard to manage. So I think a lot of what we do has to do with us being wise about how we frame things, what we focus on our personal liberty and development, instead of focusing on, waging a civil war. That's not going to help anybody. And when you do things, make sure that you insulate yourself from the outer world and isolate yourself from the outer world, in the sense that you don't want to create harm for other people with your experiments. You want to make sure that all people that are in the impact zone of your actions are actually there voluntarily. And out of that, you can often learn that the state isn't really interested in dealing with everything, but only with dealing with the things that raise too much public attention, that create too much harm.
Negative public attention.
I
think if you follow that strategy, you will also create a lot of support, because I think crypto anarchists are not the only people who see that there are like a lot of problems in the world.
Most people do that.
Most people do that, and there's a lot of people who understand that in order to solve these problems, we need to experiment with different solutions, and this is one way how to experiment with different solutions. And And as long as we focus on, on the positive thing, like we want to create better alternatives and not fight other things, there's a lot of goodwill that can be earned, even by people who like would identify as statists, but who can see the value in experimenting with alternative solutions.
And I think that the whole area of alternative solutions is strongly growing right now. I mean, we have a resurgence of intentional communities of alternative lifestyles. People want to figure out how to live better. Nobody's really satisfied with the system. Maybe not even the people that run the system. There are probably hundreds of millions of people in the West that would like to be in a position where they can try out better solutions. And you can see that. I mean, around Berlin, there are dozens of intentional communities, that have been founded in the last 10 years, maybe. So people want to experiment with new lifestyles, with new ways on how to do economic relationships and ways how to live together and stuff like that. So we are essentially one of them. We're one more group that is trying to build a better world for ourselves, plus invitations to others. And to a certain degree, if we are able to do things better, we also take away the pressure from our opponents. In a way, when we manage to solve our own problems, and we don't have to call them to solve those problems, we make their lives easier as well, because every policeman, in the end, still prefers sitting in the car, having a donut and a coffee, over beating up a few anarchists.
A bit of the pressure wolf metaphor again, right? Yeah, I totally agree. I think that especially for a lot of younger people in the West, the default route is less and less promising.
Indeed.
It's things like, I have the feeling, I don't know, it's like, it was already when I was growing up, I had the feeling that my parents, they had like this, they were living in this phase where things were getting better. So if you would work hard, you would get a good life, so to say. And I had already the feeling that it was getting a lot harder for my generation. It's basically like you work hard and you get, you maintain a good life. And for the current generation, I have the feeling it's like you work your ass off and you belong to, you belong to the best of your cohort, and you still don't even come close to what the older generations could achieve. I mean, just things like, probably a lot of that caused by fiat money, but things like, this insanely increasing prices for education and healthcare, basically insane rent prices. I mean, what do you do if you're between a student debt and 50% of your income going to rent? How do you actually build any form of, capital there?
You join the second realm and start a darknet market.
Exactly. No, I think that's why a lot of people also they're like interested in these, intentional communities, because they can kind of feel that they in this like rat race, and where even the winners don't really get anywhere. I think that it's definitely happening for younger people, and a lot of them, I mean, some that just like drop out literally, we will see a lot of that too in the future, people just being hooked on their VR glasses and checking out. And others, they will create these alternatives. And one of them is building TAZs, which hopefully will all be different as well, playing around with different ideas.
So if you, dear listener, have any comment on that or any question, please write us to bitstream@taz0.org. Maybe you have another idea for the future. Also, we're very happy to hear about suggestions about future topics. We have a few more things in our pipeline to talk about, but we would like to talk about things that you are interested in. And if you really like our product, send us some cash.
Yeah, because we really don't want to apply for social welfare. That would be self-contradictory.
We will never.
Yeah,
okay.
just kidding.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks.